Thank you for joining us for our awards presentation and the Trask Lecture. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Felicia Wivchar. I am the president of SHFG for now. And I am delighted to introduce Leslie Poster, our awards committee chairman, to kick off the awards presentations. Leslie, please join us.
Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. It's my good fortune to have this position as the chair of this awards ceremony and de facto MC, and that's not just because I like being behind a microphone. Each year, it is my honor to bring together historians from across the federal government, each accomplished scholars and practitioners in their own right, to consider with admiration and fondness the work of their colleagues. I'm sure it's been a refrain in the days that we've spent together, but it bears repeating. These are hard times for federal employees, and perhaps harder times still for federal historians. I hope that this ceremony is not just a bright spot of good cheer, but also an act of uplifting hope. Part of what we evaluate is the model that these awardees present for federal historians. That is the hope, that we can continue on and do our good work and praise one another as colleagues. I also hope that our celebration will be so vibrant that those who cannot join us will still feel its warmth. To start us off, I'm pleased to welcome Christine Naberson to present our member award.
Thank you. So it is my pleasure to introduce and provide a little information about our member award recipient, who is Jennifer Ross-Nazell. And she's being awarded for her chapter titled Apollo and the Clear Lake Community, which is from NASA and the American South. This chapter examines the development of the Clear Lake suburb of Houston, which became the home to Project Apollo and NASA in the 1960s. Like other areas in the 1960s during the Cold War, the presence of Project Apollo caused Clear Lake's population to grow exponentially in a short period of time, and thus had a serious impact on the community. And in her chapter, Dr. Ross-Nazell examines the experiences of residents and the social and cultural character of this community. She draws on oral histories as well as other archival sources and makes significant contributions to both the historiographies of Project Apollo as well as to federal history. She highlights unique aspects of Project Apollo's presence, such as media attention, while at the same time providing a model for how historians might approach studying other communities that have been shaped by a significant federal presence throughout history. So please join me in congratulating her on her award. And extend the handshake.
Julie Prieto will now present the prize for article or essay.
Hi, everyone. Each year, SHFG bestows on an article or essay an award that furthers our understanding of federal history. This year, the committee is proud to give this honor to Natalie Shibley for Policing Venereal Disease at Fort Huachuca, 1941 to 1945, which was published in the Journal of Military History in April 2024. This article details the experiences of soldiers at Fort Huachuca, in particular its large population of African Americans during World War II, by examining how the Army policed and treated venereal diseases at the installation. In doing so, Shibley reveals that the project of surveilling soldiers emerged out of a complex and often fraught negotiation between Army officials in Washington, local officers, medical professionals, area residents, journalists, and the soldiers themselves. Shibley provides a window onto how the Big Army dealt with large issues like race and gender but it also creates a portrait of everyday life for men at war but far from combat. Join me in congratulating Dr. Shibley for her work and in receiving this award.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to receive this prize, so thank you to the Society and especially to the Awards Committee and to the Journal of Military History for publishing the article. Thanks very much.
We gotta have the good stuff in the photo. Claire Jerry will now present the Excellence in New Media Award.
I'm very happy to be here representing our committee, which also included Thomas Faith and Mircea Martiano. And as you probably know, the Excellence in New Media Award is given in recognition of creativity, innovation, and contribution to the public's understanding of federal history. And this particular award this year is also going to a group project that I think demonstrates some of the successful and important work we do collaboratively across institutions and across divisions. This year's award winner goes to the project USS Shenandoah, the United States Navy's first rigid airship. And officially, it was being presented by the Smithsonian Institution. But as a person who's also at the Smithsonian, I can tell you how significant it is that the three members of this represent two different parts of the Smithsonian Institution. And in a moment, I'll be inviting to the stage Lynn Heidelbaugh from the Postal Museum and Amanda Lawhead and Thomas Payon from Air and Space. The USS Shenandoah was the first U.S.-built rigid airship. And this very interesting story is told through a variety of creative means by this particular team. It used the Story Maps platform. It used digital storytelling. It used a nimble approach to what NASM calls their Deep Dives program. It presents to the viewers and the readers a variety of Smithsonian artifacts and documents that are not available for view elsewhere. And in particular, this project is noteworthy for its demonstrated commitment to accessibility in creating an additional version of the website that meets WCAG AA standards. This is something that this team worked very diligently on, and as somebody who read everything that they submitted and went to all the pages, I'm very, very impressed and very honored to give this award. So would Lynn, Amanda, and Thomas please join me at the stage?
Thank you so much for having us here. It really was a team effort to get this created. This is the first Story Maps project we'd ever done, so there was a lot of experimentation and trial and error, but we had a lot of support and it came out great. Thank you again so much.
We've made it to the halfway point, which is a great opportunity to pause and thank the so many fantastic, dedicated folks who read so much, so many books and articles and testimonials and resumes to make this ceremony happen. So if we can get a round of applause for them, I would appreciate it. Unfortunately, our next two awardees are not going to be able to join us. That just means that we have to clap louder. So I'll welcome Terrence Rucker to present our book award.
Good afternoon, everyone. The SHFG Book Prize Committee is pleased to announce that the winner of the 2025 award is Lindsay M. Chervinsky's Making the Presidency, John Adams, and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Through a masterful use of primary sources, Dr. Chervinsky explores Adams's unique challenge of succeeding George Washington as president. During a single term, Adams demonstrated that someone else could be president and that the institution of the presidency could survive beyond Washington. Adams relied on his past experiences in the Continental Congress, as a diplomat in Europe, and skills as a lawyer to create his own vision of a chief executive. Adams also contended with a cabinet that challenged his authority as president. From Vice President Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to run against Adams in 1800, to Washington loyalists such as Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, who tried to undermine Adams's desire to maintain peace between the United States and France. The book is a wonderful way of reanalyzing an institution that we think we are familiar with, but there is plenty to learn about it as you're going through the book. Yes, right.
So we'll get a photo to send when we send the certificate. And now Jordan Grant will present the Historic Preservation and Exhibitions Award.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the committee, it's my pleasure to announce that this year's Historic Preservation and Exhibitions Award will go to a cross-departmental team at the Department of Energy's Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in Batavia, Illinois. The team's project was titled Using Geographic Information Systems to Ensure Historic Preservation, and that's just what it did. The project team included NEPA Program Manager and Cultural Resource Specialist Samantha Pinnock, Software Engineer Josh Janot, and Environmental Specialist Eric Korzanowski. Working together, the team built a GIS mapping tool that gives everyone at the Fermilab campus an up-to-date inventory of both the active construction projects that are going on, as well as all of the historically and culturally significant areas on the 1,600-plus acre campus. And this is, as you might expect, a vitally important tool and a location that combines very deep history and very active scientific research. And beyond protecting the site's resources, the new GIS tool encourages every employee, staff member, and researcher working at the Fermilab to see themselves as stewards of the site's long history. So please join me today in giving our awardees a round of applause.
I have a feeling, based on the number of State Department historians that I'm seeing, that there may be some eagerness for this year's Trask Lecture. I have the honor of introducing Elizabeth Charles, who will be making the introductions for your lecturer.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming, not only to the award ceremony and the lecture this afternoon, but also for your support of the society, your support of our conference. I also want to thank Julie for putting this whole conference together. And Felicia as our outgoing president, because it is so much more work than you realize. So thanks to you both. So I am here today. It is my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Kristen Alberg, who is the recipient of this year's Roger Trask Award. As many of you know, Kristen retired from my office, our office, the Office of the Historian at the Department of State, last June, after an over 20-year career working in various capacities on the Foreign Relations of the United States series for the office. It is almost impossible to explain the impact Kristen's dedicated service, diligent work, mentoring, and expertise, a lot of the time at herding cats, had on the office and the Frus series. Her retirement left a huge hole in the office that we are still attempting to fill, but we are attempting to do so by living up to the standards that Kristen set for the Foreign Relations series and as a mentor and a colleague. She worked tirelessly to produce and promote the Foreign Relations series in and outside of the office and within the scholarly community. She served several roles in the office, but her last position as assistant to general editor of Frus is where she really focused on the series and the craft of the series. She reviewed foreign relations volumes to ensure that the office met our congressional mandate to be thorough, accurate, and reliable, and to make the series the best it could be for the scholarly public and everyone who uses Frus. Another vital contribution that she made to the office was her mentorship of the younger generation of Frus compilers as she taught them the intricacies of Frus production and also went above and beyond to help seasoned compilers of the series make their volumes exceptional. If you stopped by her office, there was usually a deep conversation or consultation happening about a footnote, differentiating between the use of a colon, a semicolon, a comma, always the Oxford comma, no other choice. We will not let the office go into any discussions of ellipses. But those little details should tell you that the intricacies of Frus compilation are vast. And Kristen really understood this, and striving for consistency and excellence in each volume she had a hand in producing. In her over 20 years, my friends, there were many volumes, so many. She, in fact, had a hand in researching, compiling, editing, or reviewing the remarkable number of over 70 volumes in the Foreign Relations series during her tenure. It is impossible to overstate the contributions she made to our office and the series. Now, she was not only an astute documentary editor and historian, but her breadth of historic knowledge about various topics is also very deep. If you would also go by her office, maybe not a comma, maybe not other things, there was a discussion often of PL 480, Food for Peace, The Muppets, John Denver, Bob Dylan, a lot of LBJ, sometimes Hubert Humphrey, many more Minnesotans and Wisconsinites, and many of these people, in fact, appear in her foreign relations volumes. As we know in the society, her service did not stop at the historian's office. If there was a conference to plan, a committee to wrangle, a meeting about ethics standards, codes of conduct, membership, Kristen met the call. She not only served SHFG as well, but the host of other history organizations, which are in her bio in the program, show you how dedicated her service was to the greater historic community. The federal history community on the whole benefited from her service and expertise, and she continues to do this in her retirement. She continues to set an example that all of us strive to emulate. Now, in the immortal words of Kermit the Frog, this is where I tear up. In the immortal words of Kermit the Frog, who spoke last week at the commencement ceremony at the University of Maryland, he said, "In life, we find our people." And we're so honored that Kristen is one of our people in the federal history community. So thank you. And my last note is that she has titled, very appropriately, her Trask lecture, which will be printed in the journal next year, "Girl from the North Country," AKA Thanks Bob Dylan, Pursuing History and Finding Community in the Nation's Capital. So I give you our 2025 awardee.
Feels slightly strange to not give a disclaimer before this talk, but I will get over it. It is a pleasure for me to be back in the company of federal historians this afternoon. Although I did not have the opportunity to meet Roger Trask, I knew that he spent his first half of his career as a diplomatic historian in academia before serving in leadership at the NRC, the OSD History Office, and GAO, and of course as SHVUG president. Fortunately, many of you have told me about Roger's dedication to the federal history community and the kindness that he showed to its members. Therefore, I am honored to receive this year's Roger Trask Award, and I do so on behalf of my colleagues in the Office of the Historian at the Department of State for the critical work that they perform in documenting and writing the history of U.S. foreign relations and the institutional history of the U.S. Department of State. Over the last 10 months, I have spent an inordinate amount of time at my writing desk attempting to craft a compelling story of Jimmy Carter's humanitarianism, focusing upon his use of food aid. If I had to search for an analogy for what this process is like, I would turn to the Great British Bake Off, known in the United States as the Great British Baking Show, broadcast on PBS and on various streaming platforms. For those of you who watch fewer hours of television than I do, the show is predicated on tasking bakers each week with a specific skill or baking style. Part of the competition asks the bakers to devise a showstopper creation that corresponds to the theme, while showcasing their imaginativeness and baking prowess. Prior to the actual bake, the television viewers see detailed illustrations of these intended masterpieces. But as we all know, baking can be fraught. Any number of things can go wrong during the process. The meringue is too eggy, the cake does not rise, you forget to add some of your decorations, someone catches their oven mitt on fire, and so on. The resultant product is not what you imagined, and you wish that you had been able to translate that vision in your head into something transcendent rather than a wobbly cake with messy piping that appears poised to slide off the counter onto the floor. When I started writing the Carter book, I had a definite vision in terms of how I would scaffold, build, and complete the chapters. But much like the experience of these British bakers, what I've created does not necessarily match what I constructed in my head. Yet sometimes, as on the Great British Bake Off and in life generally, you produce something of which you are extremely proud. That you can do so stems from the willingness of others to encourage you, in the same way that others have mentored them. My colleagues in the Office of the Historian, in SHVUG and throughout the historical profession, have exemplified this by discussing their experiences, providing well-considered feedback, and supporting each other while adapting to unforeseen circumstances of a global pandemic. Collegiality perhaps is even more important in the federal history space, given how the nature of the work, depending on your agency or your work product, differs in some noticeable ways from academia. To paraphrase the best band ever, in my federal history career, I got by with a lot of help from my friends. For the entirety of my federal history career, I worked on the Foreign Relations of the United States series, the official history of major foreign policy decisions and significant diplomatic activity of the United States government. Each presidential subseries consists of multiple volumes that document bilateral and multilateral relationships, emerging global issues, key intellectual themes, and diplomatic conflagrations. In its over 160-year history, the series has undergone contextual and technological changes and experienced significant challenges, which you can read about in the award-winning Through Thorough, Accurate, and Reliable, A History of the Foreign Relations of the United States series, written by 4 of my colleagues, some of whom are in the room, and published in 2015. What remains constant is reflected in the title of the FRUS history. Historians strive to produce a thorough, accurate, and reliable documentary history of U.S. foreign relations by researching all available archival sources, selecting the most relevant illuminating documentation, and contextualizing it with the use of footnotes and editorial notes. I first came to know the ruby-red buckram-bound volumes of the Foreign Relations series as a graduate student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I ended up in graduate school and in Lincoln due to some fortuitous circumstances I experienced at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. When I entered college in September 1993, I had planned to become a high school history teacher. However, I pursued a different career path after experiencing some dynamic professors in the classroom who subsequently became my history and political science advisors. Joel Cyprus and Halil Haji Dokanchi did not sugarcoat the difficulties of pursuing graduate degrees in history while remaining supportive of my goal. Without their investment in my academic success, I doubt that I would have been as prepared, at least in terms of doing the actual academic work, during my first year of graduate school. It was all the other aspects, the transition from a small to large campus, my young age compared to the other graduate students, the fact that I hadn't declared a specialization within my field of US history, that caused much angst. But as Joel and Haji appeared in my life when I most needed them, so too did the professor who has had the most profound influence on my life and who introduced me to the Foreign Relations series. My advisor, the late Lloyd Ambrosius, completed his doctorate at the University of Illinois in 1967 under the direction of Norman Graebner and joined the faculty at the University of Nebraska that August. The history department hired Lloyd to replace Roger Trask's brother, David Trask, who had accepted a position at SUNY Stony Brook and would later serve as the historian of the Department of State in the mid to late 1970s. During Lloyd's tenure at Nebraska, he had developed a reputation as a noted scholar of the Woodrow Wilson administration. Among the many, many books stored in his too small campus office, Lloyd had several of the World War I Fruce volumes prominently displayed, and quite frankly, they probably belonged in the library, but I wasn't going to say anything. After he agreed that a dissertation on Lyndon Johnson and Food for Peace seemed like a sensible idea, he suggested that I go over to the library and familiarize myself with the Johnson F-U-R-U-S, as he enunciated it, before I planned my first research trip to the LBJ Library in Austin. While Lloyd was a great proponent of the series, he lamented the slow pace of declassification and intra- and interagency issues that had tripped up Fruce in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. In a November 1990 article in the Daily Nebraskan, the University of Nebraska's student newspaper, Lloyd asserted, "I think it's imperative to get the Foreign Relations series out in a timely fashion," quipping that the declassification slowdown has a direct impact on the history of American foreign relations. By the time I began researching my dissertation in 1999, Lloyd remained hopeful that the enactment of the Fruce Statute in 1991 had resolved the access impasse that had prohibited Department of State historians from accessing crucial government documentation for inclusion in the series, resulting in the publication of incomplete volumes in the early 1980s, and culminating in the resignation of the chair of the department's Historical Advisory Committee, the late Warren Cohen, in the early 1990s. The Fruce Statute, more formally known as the Foreign Relations Authorization Act, or Public Law 102-138, which George H.W. Bush signed into law on October 28, 1991, added a new title to the Department of State's Basic Authorities Act of 1956, requiring that the series include all records needed to accurately document major foreign policy decision-making. Lloyd similarly hoped that enough LBJ volumes had been published to aid in my dissertation research. As I spent hours on the first floor of the campus library, either photocopying Fruce or transcribing it by hand when I was short on funds, and a side note, the Office of the Historian had yet to put electronic versions of the volumes online, so that was what you had, I admit that I did not consider the art and craft of producing documentary volumes. At that stage in my life, Fruce was one primary source of many, granted a very crucial one, that I needed to consult to craft an acceptable dissertation detailing and interpreting Lyndon Johnson's use of foreign food aid as part of his internationalized Great Society. Contemplating the work, skill, and collaboration involved in the Fruce process was not a going concern, as I worried about completing the dissertation and obtaining employment. Once I began working in the Office of the Historian in the fall of 2003, and especially once I began compiling Fruce, I had to pivot away from the solitary research and writing of narrative history and toward a more collaborative model and approach that reflected the best practices in documentary editing. Without going into too much detail here, Fruce compilers have access to all relevant records located not only at the presidential libraries and the National Archives, but also housed within the agencies themselves or at the Washington National Records Center, resulting from access agreements granted to the Department of State. The inference here is that department historians have an access to a vastly larger universe of documentation than the graduate student or the non-governmental professional historian. And because this corpus of documents is so large, and in some cases unfamiliar, it has the potential to stymie the new historian as they must adjust to multiple research practices and policies of each agency and cultivate positive relationships with archivists and records managers. And beyond the daunting research stage, how does one take reams of photocopied and electronic documents and select the most relevant memoranda, telegrams, and reports to document significant activity? How do you tell a story in documents rather than a narrative form? Can you be okay with your division chief and the general editor of the series critiquing your work without you thinking that it is an indictment of your skills as a historian? I admit that these questions perplexed me in a good way in early 2007 as I began researching a volume in the Nixon Ford subseries on the intellectual foundations of U.S. foreign policy. I was fortunate that several colleagues whose tenure in the office predated mine were willing to share their expertise developed and honed while compiling their first volumes. Here, I will single out my supervisor at the time, M. Todd Bennett, who is now a professor of history at Eastern Carolina University. Originally, Todd was assigned to compile the Nixon Ford Foundations volume. After he received promotion to chief of the Europe and Global Issues Division, he asked historian and fellow Wisconsinite Alexander Wieland and me to take over the volume's remaining research here at the Library of Congress and at the Nixon Presidential Materials Project at the National Archives, and then we would begin compiling. As our supervisor, Todd helped guide, but he never dictated our approach. He took time to answer our questions, and I admit that I had many. Within the pantheon of Frus volumes, Foundations volumes present their own unique challenges. You are not documenting a crisis like the Persian Gulf War, nor are you capturing multilateral relations or the development of foreign economic policy or tense arms control negotiations. The compiler must view the entire canvas, focus on a few key elements, and then work to bring those out so that they illustrate an administration's collective mindset, cognizant of your page limits, of course. And you approach this exercise in such a way that you are complementing the other volumes within a presidential subseries. To enable me to paint this picture, Todd provided incisive feedback on my compilations. He offered suggestions as to which documents to keep, which to jettison, and which to incorporate into footnotes. And he did so in such a way that honored my vision for the volume, but improved it, based on his own Frus compiling experience and his oversight of other volumes produced within our division. Todd's imprint on this volume and the 3 Foundations volumes that I compiled for the Carter, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush administrations is evident. His approach to Frus and the historians compiling it was one that I strived to emulate throughout the remainder of my career in the office. This came into sharp relief when I became assistant general editor of the Frus series in 2011. A newly established position that year, the assistant general editor served as part of the management team with responsibilities for helping the general editor perform a second substantive review of Frus volumes, managing the office's many archival access agreements, and compiling Frus. The general editor at the time, Steve Randolph, left it up to me within reason to figure out how to approach the job. By this point, I'd spent half my time in the office as a technical editor and the other half as a compiler. If I could somehow combine what I learned from Todd about compiling Frus and mentoring younger colleagues with the skills that I had developed early on in copy editing volumes, then maybe I could make some sort of contribution to the series while encouraging my colleagues to produce exceptional work. Once again, I faced a learning curve. Somehow, I had to avoid pedantry while still adhering to the high standards of the series. After some trial and error where I certainly was overzealous in recommending things to footnote, I accepted that my role, like Todd's had been, was to guide rather than to dictate. While I would continue to correct the obvious mistakes, such as a compiler forgetting to footnote Public Law 480 or failing to explain a reference to Sesame Street, I let other things go, and I embraced the reality that Frus is a team effort. Once again, paraphrasing the greatest band of all time, I didn't have to carry the world or Frus upon my shoulders. I needed to focus on how successful the compiler was in selecting documents and how their volume harmonized with other volumes in the subseries. I might suggest to a compiler that they substitute one document for another, or include additional memoranda to illustrate the competing interests at play in policy formulation. Ultimately, it remained a compiler's responsibility to consider thoughtfully the critique of their supervisors, me, and the general editor, first Adam Howard and currently Kathleen Rasmussen, and then revise the manuscript. In the process of researching, annotating, and revising their first volumes, a compiler would also come to see themselves as part of a team dedicated to carrying out this extremely vital and visible project. In addition, those of us who had compiled multiple volumes had an obligation to be of help to our newer colleagues as they experienced the joys and frustrations of slogging through beat-up FRCs, fighting with fidgety microfilm readers, or understanding a presidential administration's record management philosophy. I experienced a similar sense of responsibility and collaboration in my more than 20 years of membership in the Society for History in the federal government. As I described in one of my president's messages for the Federalist, my former colleague in the Office of the Historian, John Carland, encouraged me and my colleagues to join SHVUG to broaden and deepen our connections with other federal historians. Such a community was not foreordained at SHVUG's founding in the late 70s, as former SHVUG President Richard Hewlett noted in a 1999 article for the Public Historian. There was a real question whether we could lure the historians from their isolated areas and federal agencies to join, much less participate in, such an organization. Happily, these concerns came to pass, and the organization that I joined around its 25th anniversary welcomed me and a new generation of federal historians. The Society's small size allowed me to develop professional relationships and friendships with a diverse array of historians, and this is no small feat for an introvert like me. These historians modeled generosity in many ways, both in their collegiality and in their service to SHVUG. Both attributes came into sharp relief during my presidency, a year devoted to commemorating SHVUG's 40th anniversary. After celebrating the past presidents and founding members at the October 2019 Hewlett Lecture, the Executive Council devoted considerable time to planning a joint annual meeting with the Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic Region Group. Scheduled to take place in March 2020 at the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. What I had envisioned as a capstone event for the 40th anniversary year sadly did not come to be. The emergence and spread of COVID-19 weighed heavily on the minds of the Executive Council during our March 5th meeting at the National Archives. The Council agreed to devise a suite of health and safety procedures to implement at the annual meeting, while understanding that some conference participants would opt out. Less than a week later, the intensifying situation forced us to cancel the annual meeting. As Elizabeth Charles recounted in her summer-fall 2020 President's Message for the Federalist, she, Mandy Shalhoub, and I sat in Elizabeth's plant-filled office at the Department of State on March 10th to take part in a conference call with Jesse Kratz at the National Archives and Matea Sanders at Andrews Air Force Base. Although the financial considerations for canceling the meeting remained paramount, our greatest concern was the health of SHVUG and OMAR members and other conference participants. We were in constant communication with Stephanie Rowe at the National Council on Public History and Hanji Selby at the Organization of American Historians to ascertain if any of these meetings would take place. Once we reached the decision to cancel, Elizabeth, Mandy, Jesse, and Matea diligently worked to inform the membership, process refunds, and maintain good relationships with the understanding staff of the Bavarian Inn. They, the Executive Council, and other SHVUG members continued to expend their considerable talents from their homes to keep the Society active and functioning throughout the remainder of 2020 and 2021, moving Executive Council meetings and Bill Williams' Trask Lecture online over Zoom. We also attempted to innovate by launching an online Friday Colloquia series that featured talks by Don Ritchie, James Siekmeyer, and David Hamilton Gollard. In developing and executing these programs, the SHVUG leadership maintained an unwavering spirit of collegiality and demonstrated a great degree of tenacity. As many of you know, my writing desk is now located back in Lincoln, Nebraska. It is here where I contemplated, drafted, and revised this lecture and, of course, worried about how it would be received. In the process of writing and revising it, I realized that perhaps I could squeeze in another analogy to describe my work as a professional historian. Knitting is one of my hobbies, which I took up during my mid-30s, thanks to the skilled teaching of my colleague and fellow Schwug member, Sarah Barrett. She and other knitting colleagues and friends encouraged my first sad attempts at garter stitch, replete with drop stitches and unexplainable yarn overs. These early attempts were in no way serviceable as garments or accessories. However, the more I practiced and asked for assistance when I needed it, the more proficient I became, to the point that I could attempt knitting Fair Isle. Easily recognizable, these colorful patterns hail from Fair Isle, one of the Shetland Islands. To knit this pattern, you must be able to decipher symbols embedded in a chart, maintain an accurate stitch count, and manipulate 2 colors of yarn to get the pattern to emerge, switching to other paired colors in subsequent rows. And you must maintain the proper tension so that the pattern you are painting with the yarn doesn't distort. Sometimes, and in my case many times, you make mistakes, requiring you to work the pattern back, or in dire circumstances, forcing you to unravel the entire project. Other times, you may find yourself stuck, and that's when you depend upon your knowledgeable knitting friends to explain or demonstrate a particular technique and encourage you to keep going. And, in a way, the work that we perform as federal historians is much like knitting, Fair Isle. It can be daunting at first, and you must deploy your intellect and your skills in multiple ways, draw upon the expertise of your colleagues, and balance competing objectives along the way. In the end, ultimately, you produce something that is wonderfully textured and long-lasting. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture and that you stay for the reception and get to chat a little bit. Thanks again.